Testing, testing. Alright, hold on just a second. I apologize for that loud noise. Um, I had to pause that. I had to get my settings going. Can you guys hear me okay? Testing, testing. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. In any case, I'm gonna do my best. I'm running a 102-degree fever, and I have a pounding sinus headache. But the show must go on. My name is Neal Kiernan. Um, I'm the radio host for a radio show called V Radio. As you can see from the static image there, v-radio.org is my website. The reason I have a static image is I don't actually own a webcam. I do use Justin TV from time to time, mostly to play movies and stuff for people, but that's really about it. Um, Give a little background on myself. For many years, I was an independent as far as my political thoughts were concerned. And eventually, somebody linked me a video in this last election called Ron Paul Courageously Speaks the Truth. And therein, I saw a politician being more honest about the issues of our foreign policy. And that essentially led me to taking a more direct interest in politics. I worked with the Ron Paul campaign, and then eventually worked with Senator Mike Gravel's campaign. I'm actually the guy that convinced him to go libertarian. Um, and I joined the Libertarian Party. Um, can you guys still hear me? Somebody said they lost me. Try refreshing. Anyway, can anybody else still hear me? Okay, good. Anyway, as I was saying, I became a delegate to the Libertarian National Convention in 2008, and I was a candidate for Congress in Michigan's 10th District, also as a Libertarian. Eventually, I saw the film Zeitgeist Addendum. That was the first time I'd ever been exposed to the resource-based economy model, and I did more research and went and met the progenitor of the concept, Mr. Jacques Fresco. Got to know him really well, read his book, and I still consider myself a libertarian, but my economic ideas are different now, obviously. Um, One of the major differences, although I've since discovered there's actually a pretty good presentation on YouTube about left libertarianism that I think would be a bit easier for me to explain what my background is, but what my views on these things are now. But um, that's just kind of what got me here. So I do understand the libertarian perspective, and overall, the reasons that things were changed is just that it was what I liked. And basically, I liked what I heard when I was studying the resource-based economy. So I'm definitely not going to be at my best today. I have some of a written thing that I'm going to do here, and at some point during the broadcast, I'm going to play a video. In order to do that, I may have to disconnect and reconnect because I'm going to have to reset my sound settings, which you can't do in the middle of a Justin TV broadcast, but otherwise you guys won't hear the video. So, alright, I wrote this presentation while I was still feverish and not doing so well, so I'm like I said, it's not going to be my best work, but we'll see. A scientific approach to a stateless society, the resource-based economy. Um, we libertarians struggle to help people understand our ideas for how the state itself is a cause for a lot of the world's problems in general. We run for office or we support candidates who are the closest to our views. We might even try to act against candidates who do not support our views. But let's be realistic a moment. This system was not designed to facilitate freedom. Any system that allows campaign contributions from the wealthy will always favor those who are wealthy. A system that leads to a plutocracy. When you study the actual history of the men that many people call the founding fathers, you find out that they took a lot of actions to ensure that the wealth of the nation would rule the nation, all the while maintaining a farce of choice for every citizen. They could choose their leaders, but the part that was left out of the description was that those choices would be limited by the money a given candidate had or had access to. And as the wealth gap grows to higher points than it ever has in history, this trend will only continue. Many libertarians advocate getting rid of the fiat currency to solve this problem. I understand this sentiment, and of course nobody in the freedom movement likes the Federal Reserve. However, the question I tend to ask is, again, if you watch the documentary film The Money Masters, you watch an extremely long documentary about the many, many times that the money system has been corrupted. It is the one thing that is consistent about monetary systems is that they will be corrupted again and again and again. And as Albert Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It is unrealistic that any group that understands these problems with the state are ever going to gain power through the system that was created to maintain the power in the hands of the elite. And that is why I suggest to libertarians an alternative, and that is to make the state as irrelevant to their lives as possible. The term off-the-grid living applies to people who have managed to get themselves a piece of land, build renewable energy systems such as solar panels and geothermal heating and cooling systems, and have an infrastructure in place to produce their own food. It requires an initial investment, but I would ask libertarians to consider what sort of freedom this provides for someone who makes this investment. At this point, the ebbs and flows of the market are mostly irrelevant to you, meaning if you've gotten off the grid. You are virtually immune to the effects of the inflation, interest rates, etc. You can work for profit if you wish, but you don't really have to. You can trade with others, but you don't really have to. Your personal economy is based on the resources available to you, not the whims of the state or an employer. At least for yourself and your family, you have achieved a personal resource-based economy. Part of successful off-the-grid living is evaluating scientifically how to make the most efficient use of your resources and energy. You design your home to use as little electricity as possible, making use of the Earth's natural heat and light as much as feasible. Any equipment you build for use in your home is designed to last as long as possible. Now, so basically we're talking about off-the-grid living, which is essentially going out of your way to make your home as self-sustaining as possible, producing as much of anything that you need for yourself as possible. It takes the concepts of personal responsibility to a new level, which is to say that it's not that trade or barter or whatever would become illegal to you, it's that it's not as relevant to you. And you want to make it as irrelevant to you as possible. And that's essentially the reasoning behind my suggestion to people, and this is starting to catch on in different libertarian groups that I've talked to, is that, forever hoping that the state is going to go away, at least not in our foreseeable future, is kind of, it's just an unrealistic goal at this point. But people who live off the grid have so much more freedom in general, and that's essentially why I say to them, to get kind of an idea of what it is that we propose in a resource-based economy, if you're a libertarian, even a market libertarian, the idea that you can make the market irrelevant to you is at that point an expression of freedom that goes beyond just the issue of, well, I'm an entrepreneur, I have my own money, etc., etc. Rather than investing essentially a lot of money in an education that they're going to go out of their way to make irrelevant as well, this is the other thing, is that the other side of this, the corporations and such, are doing a really good job of going out of their way to make us irrelevant to them. They're already doing that. They're automating as many jobs as they can. They're outsourcing anything that they can't, and only in so long as they haven't figured out ways to automate them. That's the technological unemployment concept. I see this firsthand here in Michigan. The auto industry dried up, and now I'm watching as they automate everything they can get their hands on, and the companies just pick up and leave to any place that they can where the people are desperate enough to take whatever wages that you'll offer them, throw the scraps off the table. Now, that's why I'm saying is that essentially, at least from what I would call the techno-libertarian, you use science and technology to free yourself. You utilize these self-sustaining technologies to eliminate the effects that the state, the market, any of those things would have on you. Then you don't have to worry about it anymore. And there's a lot of different films where you can look into this. Garbage Warrior, for example, is a film about a guy who learned to make self-sustaining homes mostly just out of garbage. And once he had gotten his own self-sustaining life, he felt more free than he ever could, any other way. The stress went down to next to nothing, and he had nothing but free time to do whatever he wanted because he had a mostly self-sustaining environment in which he lived. That's a personal resource-based economy. So then, hold on just a moment. I'm on the air. Not right now. Sorry about that, guys. Um, Now, what if a group of people decided to form a community based on this premise of minimizing the need for trade or exchange of money? They put their resources together to make an off-the-grid community, wherein the very design of the community itself is to make the absolute best use of resources and energy, where any product produced for use within that community is made with the goal of lasting as long and of being as efficient as possible. Within this community, things like transportation are owned by the community and made available as needed rather than each member of the community owning their own car that they are only going to use an hour or so a day. The need for personal transportation in of itself could be curtailed if almost not completely eliminated through the strategic use of mass transportation. Now, this isn't to say that we're going to make it illegal for you to own your own car. The idea is that you create an environment within your community to eliminate the need for everybody to have their own car. This is just one example of how when you're dealing with a resource-based economy, you want to design your community in such a way that, once again, the need for personal ownership goes away. Nobody's going to stop you. If you really want to own your own car, that's fine. We don't believe in coercion or force. We're very big on the non-aggression principle. Um, but if you design your town in just the right way, your need to own a car starts to go away. Now that's just one example, but you have a community of people that are willingly getting together for the purpose of essentially living in this kind of self-sustaining community. Just looking here at the chat room for a moment. What we got here? Cyber commies. Yeah, that's something I always loved about the libertarian community for being a supposedly free-thinking group. They're pretty ruthless to anybody who doesn't think exactly like them. It's one of the reasons why. So the things actually that Michael Badnarik said during his last speech that really rung out with me was the fact that the Libertarian Party in particular was held back a great deal by the endless infighting and bickering and the way that the average libertarian conducted themselves during debate with endless ad hominem attacks, things of that nature. Anyway, so group of people decides to live in a self-sustaining community wherein the need for labor is minimized as much as possible, and you're doing your best, obviously, to be as ecologically sound as possible. Now, what if an entire country decided to redesign their infrastructure this way? What if the world did? There are some things, of course, we would have to address first, and some of them I think would be best be dealt with by some new applications of libertarian philosophy, and reevaluating what the function of private property should be. Before I get into this next section, let me make sure that I'm addressing everybody here. No, I think infighting is always counterproductive. Let's see, anything else in here? They're just communists who believe they've solved the calculation problem with a supercomputer. Let's talk about the calculation problem for a moment. Ludwig von Mises declared that the economic calculation problem would never be solved like 50 years ago. There was a time when technicians said that nobody would ever fly. In fact, they were writing books about that same issue around the same time the Wright brothers were building the Wright Flyer. And I mean, if it's enough for you to say that, oh well, Mises said so, so therefore it is so, and will always be so, that's just not enough for me. I've done enough studying into looking into it, and the funny thing is that even in the 70s they had computers that could do this. There's a project called Project Cybersyn that was used in Chile the country meaning, and they did a pretty good job of calculating, and that was using computers that were really, really outdated in comparison to what we could do now. Um, I haven't even really gotten into the issue of the calculation issue, um, but when you have access to information, because those are the things that Mises talked about that were a problem, which was that they'll never have all of the information, they'll never have the ability to comprehend all of that information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Mises was talking about a state of technology that doesn't exist anymore. So that's basically it. If you're willing to just go along with that, it's one of the dogmatic issues. Approach the ECP from an RBE perspective. Um, see exactly what, Dave Martin? Well, I'll tell you what. Let me go into part of the things that I had in here to kind of explain why the necessity is coming. Um, Now, I went over the issue of people getting off the grid. I presume people understand that people do get off the grid. Um, and people getting off the grid, I guess, are not commies. At least that wouldn't be my expression on that. Um, but anyway, because it's often difficult to explain this as far as the necessities for why we need to create a system like this, let's scale things down to something that people understand a little bit better. To help illustrate my point, let's scale down the situation on our planet to that of a spaceship. Let's say a dozen people living on board. Let's say that the people on the ship all owned a portion of the ship themselves. The vessel was crewed entirely by libertarians. The crew develop a credit system to aid them in exchanging with one another various goods that they may produce themselves on board the ship. Each crew member owns their own cabin on board, but because the vessel is a closed system, it's clear that things that individual crew members do have the potential of harming the ship itself, but everyone has the right to do whatever they want on their own property. Now let's say that a crew member named Jack has decided he wants to produce some widgets for profit in his cabin. The widgets are useful and sought out by other crew members. However, after some time, the science officer, after doing an analysis of the atmospheric conditions on board, notices that there is a harmful toxin being introduced to the ship's life support systems by the widget manufacturing process in Jack's cabin. The problem is, it is Jack's cabin, and therefore his private property, right? What we have here is Jack taking an indirect aggressive action against everyone on board, but the crew members are powerless to do anything about it. After all, it's his private property. The typical libertarian answer would be for everyone on board to engage in a lawsuit against Jack. This is complicated, though, as Jack has made a lot of money on board via his widgets and has amassed a formidable fortune. Jack, of course, invests in some propaganda in the form of counter-studies that state that the science officer is incorrect in his statements that the widget's manufacturing is causing the toxin to be added to the ship's environmental systems. Perhaps a well-placed smear campaign against the honesty or character of the science officer himself. Eventually, everyone has forgotten about this business of the toxin in the ship's infrastructure. The ship's doctor doesn't mind because, after all, he is getting a lot of business himself, treating the effects of this toxin, so it's not really in his best interest to see the toxin removed either. Now, essentially, what I suggest for this that would be to apply the what I would call the green libertarian concept, and that is that the non-aggression principle should apply to, in our instance, the Earth. And obviously, when you're on a spaceship, it's a bit easier to see that. It doesn't matter if you own a section of the hull. If you punch a hole in it, you're endangering everybody on board. So the non-aggression principle should apply to the ship itself. I think that the same thing is true of applying the non-aggression principle to the environment. Because even if it is on your own property, like right here in Michigan, we have Nestle. They came in and they bought a lot of land that has access to our water table, so they're sucking the water out of it and doing damage to the local ecology, but the court system won't do anything about it. And because it's their property, there isn't really anything we can do about it. Now, we come to the question of resources. Even if the ship itself, let's say Jack thanks to his sales of widgets, decides to buy some critical systems on the ship. Should someone on the ship be allowed to buy, say, the oxygen On Earth, we don't think much about this because for the moment air is free. Well, hey, a free market and all that. Can't limit anyone to do what they want with their money. But there is only so much oxygen on the ship. Since he owns it, what if he decides to say, give a minimum amount of oxygen to everyone on board, but actually uses a great deal of it in his own cabin? Nobody can stop him. It is, after all, his oxygen. Maybe he decides to start selling it to people for an unfairly high price. The consumers on board who can afford to buy his oxygen can of course buy it. But those who are not fortunate enough to have enough money to pay for it, well, they just get to die. Or even worse, let's say that people start using oxygen without any consideration to how much there is available. This eventually leads to critical shortages. Some crew members even start dying due to these shortages, and eventually, because of the whims of consumers on board the vessel, everyone dies. That means essentially we cannot continue to consume infinitely, particularly not things that, well, are critical to our survival on a planet with finite resources. It's actually a ridiculous utopian notion that we can forever just continue to produce endlessly on a planet that has finite resources. And it's also a utopian vision that we can continue to pollute it in such a way that will render the planet uninhabitable. Now, if there's only so much food on board, obviously you're not going to be inclined to let one person eat and waste a large quantity of food. If it is not an act of tyranny on your part to ask the person not to do this, the act of tyranny is coming from the person who is demanding to eat some of the finite food on board any way he chooses. After all, he bought it with his own money, and he is hungry right now. The fact that his actions done on a consistent basis will have implications later is not important to him at the moment, and since he has the money, he therefore has the right. I think the obvious problematic nature of this scenario can be seen. Perhaps some resources, and in fact all of the resources on a given spaceship that are critical to survival, could be considered the common heritage of everyone on board, and that steps should be taken to ensure that these resources are not squandered or misused. When you're talking about finite resources in a closed system, such as a spaceship, it's pretty clear that allowing anyone to own all of a given critical resource puts them in a position to have entirely too much power. And again, any planet that is finite in its resources and has an ecology in danger of being rendered uninhabitable by actions of people living there should be considered the same way. Just as a side note, all planets are finite, and currently we only have one. And as our population rises, and as our technology's impact on the planet we live on increases as well, the more intensely our technology allows us to produce goods from the finite resources on the planet, the smaller this planet gets. Now what I say is that essentially what I'm getting at here is that it's not about any kind of coercion from anybody else. There's only so many resources on the planet. And the planet can only sustain a certain amount of ecological damage before it becomes a problem. And that's the reason why, as I use the example of the spaceship, when you're up on a spaceship, it isn't a capitalist system that you're engaging in. There's a specific amount of stuff that's stored on board. It's planned out and essentially, weighed and calculated by the scientists in question when they're putting together all of the data necessary for that ship and the trip in question. So that's why I say, what about an alternative? One I might add is used on an actual spaceships today. How about we look very critically at how much air, food, etc. we have on board and find a way to ensure that we are making the most efficient use of all the things to be sure that everyone on board survives, not just those with money. We design the spaceship itself, the cabins, the mess hall, etc., to be as efficient as possible. In efficient, we mean to effectively use the energy, oxygen, and other materials in question possible. When people ask, well, who makes the decisions about who gets what? The answer is no one. When you're designing a spaceship for long-distance travel, the use of resources on board the ship is not subject to opinion. Any such decisions are made using the scientific method. You create a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis in a manner that can be reproduced by other scientists. And then if those tests prove conclusive, then you act accordingly. You don't elect a politician to do this for you. You don't allow whomever happens to have the most money do this for you. The answers to questions like this are provable through science. I submit to you that we are nearing the point of no return when it comes to the spaceship scenario being applicable to Earth, and that if we don't start acting on this, it won't matter how free you think you are. The human species itself is in danger. In the concepts of private property, free trade, markets, etc., we tend to think that the market system allows us the free choice that no other system would provide. The problem is that the market system and the price system do not have a final solution outside of whatever is profitable. If there is a more efficient way to use resources that are critical on this planet, any such considerations are secondary if they are considered at all as compared to the profit involved. At the end of the day, if there are only 5 apples left on the planet, nobody has the right to take 6. It does not matter how much Ayn Rand you quote or how many free market advocates you advocate. If there are only 5 apples left, then that's all there is. We do not have the right to use more resources than actually exist. But left in the hands of consumers who are generally brainwashed by an increasingly sophisticated advertising machine utilizing psychology and sociology rather than demonstrating the benefits of a given product to get what you when you buy it, we are in a dangerous situation wherein resources are being used up on this planet without any concern whatsoever for what it is going to do to the planet and the people who live on it. In addition, we do not have the right to render the planet uninhabitable. This is not a right of a lack of right that would be enforced by any person or state. The planet itself will do a great job of the initiation of force when we as a species die off on this planet that we have rendered uninhabitable. The time has come for us to heavily consider the implications of our consumption, short-term and long-term, and for us to outgrow the utopian idea that we can produce infinitely on a planet with finite resources, without taking into consideration the ecological consequences. To do otherwise is an act of aggression upon everyone who lives on this planet, and any future generations who might live here. So let's get back to this off-the-grid idea. What if we took all the resources on the planet that are currently being used to wage war on one another and devoted them instead to creating an infrastructure that functions in the most efficient manner? What if we started treating shortages of goods that are critical to life on this planet as a threat to humanity rather than an opportunity to raise the price and therefore the profitability of that good? What if we redesign the infrastructure of this planet utilizing not the whims of consumers or the dishonest practices of politicians, but the provable solutions that science can provide? In a system wherein all of the infrastructure is designed to be as self-sustaining and self-maintaining as possible, the need for a state begins to wither away entirely. Politics is replaced by science. No political parties or their opinions, which are all too often directly controlled by their campaign contributors. Just what you can prove. If any policy is put in place that is impractical, then all one has to do to change it is to prove so using the scientific method. That's basically the beginning gist of it anyway. Hold on a second. Who determines fair? In what instance? And what about the analogy was so bad? I don't understand your point, Paul. You already have scientists synthesizing life forms and food. And what's your point? Who determines science? It's not all hypothesis and theory. And it's not theory. You have to test those things. It doesn't become science until it's been tested and proven. The reason that science is infallible is that if it's ever proven wrong, then the new information becomes the science. Nobody said you had to be our test. What are you talking about? Well, yeah, there's going to be shortages that are going to be basically treated, with alternatives scientifically, but Follow me, robot boy. Well, the ad hominem is certainly adding to the quality of the conversation. I don't really think that genetic engineering is going to replace depletable resources, and if you've done any studying into the work of Monsanto and the damage that it's actually done to the ecology, you'd know that. There's a lot of good stuff that you can go into about that, but all of the genetic engineering in the world is not going to replace the coltan, the oil, any number of other things that have come up. But I mean, we do agree that there's going to be scientific solutions, but within a market system, it kind of comes down to um, whatever is most profitable. I mean, we could have had electric cars going a long time ago, but the oil industry, concerned about securing its profit, went out of its way to make sure that didn't happen. We need to be looking at this as the absolute. We need to work it on that. But wow, you're daft. Well, everybody is certainly smarter having read you say that. I have listened to my words. I talk about this topic all the time. Well, honestly, Christopher, if the trolling continues, then that's just kind of proving that they have a fear issue that's causing them to lash out at people. Well, as far as now, that's why I suggested the off the grid thing. I honestly think that libertarians in general should be looking into off the grid living rather than trying to make this system work that isn't going to work. Off the grid living is real freedom. You don't want to be dependent on anybody any more than necessary. I mean, does everybody acknowledge that people can live off the grid? Crazy tangent about what? Well, that's what I'm proposing. That essentially society itself should become off the grid, minimizing the impact of any damage on the ecology, because we all have to live here. In addition to the idea that we should minimize the need for work as much as possible so that we're free to do other things. Yes, Dave, you can choose to ignore our plans if you want. We don't believe in coercion or force. I don't understand how that's a strange tangent, Paul. Do you deny that there are finite resources on the planet and that we need to be sustainable? Still waiting for an answer from Paul. Should we just not consider that there are finite resources on the planet? Is that an irrelevant point somehow? Crazy tangent, as you put it? Okay, well, I suppose he's not going to answer. My scientific solution is frankenfood? No, I don't recall saying that at all. Actually, the resource-based economy suggests completely organic farming. Somebody else suggested that. But you didn't answer my question, Paul. Do we live on a planet with finite resources or not? I'm still waiting for you to answer my question, Paul, so I can answer it, your question more specifically. Do we have a planet with finite resources or not? So then what is absolute in its solutions? Okay, well, if we live on a planet with finite resources, just like the spaceship example that I gave you, allowing those resources to be spent willy-nilly at the whims of consumers and people who are interested in profit, it's going to kill us all. You don't need to worry about us forcing you to do anything. Unless, of course, you just think that's a fallacy, too. Uh, Even absent the state, we can't continue to just use the resources on the planet without any concern whatsoever for what that's going to do. Okay, well, it seems to me like when you make statements like, with a big exclamation point at the end of it, you're like, well, science, you said that it's absolute, as if scientifically proven facts are not facts anymore. Are you subject to the law of gravity? Can you choose to not allow gravity to affect you? Obviously not. That's an example of a scientifically proven law. Um, we can do our best to try to irrationally think that we can just avoid it, but it will kill us. That's why Peter points out that nature is a dictatorship. There's certain limits on what we can do, and we as market consumers have a tendency just to kind of ignore that. We ignore the limitations that the planet has for the things that we're doing, and we're more interested actually in pretending that we just have infinite resources. And obviously, that's a utopia. That's not real. There's going to come a point when we have to be critical if we want everybody to survive about how we use resources. And my suggestion to you libertarians, as I said earlier, was get off the grid, make the state irrelevant. That's actually the first stage of what we suggest too. And if you want to go off and live in your own off the grid, we don't care. None of us is going to show up at your house and force you to do anything. But the planet will be forcing us to change the way that we utilize resources here. That's inevitable. As far as the economic calculation problem, the first thing that I stated was that Mises is not infallible. He made some statements. He had an opinion. There are people who disagree with him, and um, more to the point, though, as we pointed out earlier, technology has increased in its power immensely since Mises made his declaration that the economic calculation problem will never be solved. A lot of the things that complicate the economic calculation problem could go away in a society wherein social stratification based on things like fashion, uh, uh, things like that we've essentially been programmed to make us think that it's a good idea to buy a $1,000 iPhone app that says you're rich. That's an example of the kind of waste of resources that comes out of this system would just go away. Um, the concept behind it is that desires are supposedly infinite. They're not. Once you understand human behavior, it becomes very clear why people get the things that they get. It's not irrational. That's basically a cop out. It's just to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, we can't ever anticipate what anybody's going to want. If that were the case, there would be no point in advertising in the first place, because why would you bother? I mean, people just buy whatever they want willy nilly. Obviously, that's not the case. So the point behind all of that is that the reason that advertising exists is because of the fact that what people want and desire, for example, can in fact be manufactured. The only things that are common to everybody is the need for food, arable land, water, etc., etc. Those are the things that are common to everyone. And if people want some things outside of that, obviously that's not going to be a big deal. In comparison, however, to mass manufacturing a lot of the things that we do today, slowly killing us, killing off the planet, that's not a practice that can continue forever. If we live on a finite planet, infinite production cannot occur. That's obvious. It's not arguable. It's infallible to make that statement. What straw man is that? Well, I can't really keep track of the chat, um, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to playing my video now. I'm sorry to have wasted some of your time. Um, to those of you who found my ideas interesting, you can check them out at vradio.org. Um, I'm not going to try to override anybody's conditioning or dogmatic beliefs, um, and I'll go from there. But one way or another, whether or not we have anything to do with it or not, and I notice that nobody in the chat is handling this point, is that we cannot continue to do what we're doing on a planet with finite resources and not expect it to kill us. And anything short of that, anything short of that understanding is completely insincere. Well, it looks like I'm having technical problems, so I'm going to have to sign off here for a second, and I'll try to come back on.